Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. I never thought I'd be the guy with the HOA Karen story, but here we are. My name's Daniel, and 3 years ago, I purchased a beautiful 5-acre property on the outskirts of Meadowbrook Estates. The main selling point was the gorgeous restored barn that came with the land, a spacious rustic building that I've since converted into my home office and weekend workshop. I'm an architectural engineer who works from home most days, and that barn is my sanctuary. Now, Meadowbrook Estates has an HOA, but when I bought the property, I was assured that since my land was technically on the border of the neighborhood and my barn was set far back from the main road, I would only be subject to basic regulations about property maintenance. That worked just fine for me. I keep my place looking nice, pay my dues on time, and generally try to be a good neighbor. For the first 2 years, I barely interacted with the HOA at all. That all changed when Patricia Henderson, or Karen as the entire neighborhood secretly calls her, was elected HOA president last year. From day one, she made it her mission to restore order to our community, which apparently meant sending out violation notices for infractions as minor as garbage cans being visible from the street for more than 6 hours after collection day. My first run-in with Karen happened when she left a neon pink violation notice on my mailbox, claiming my barn was an unauthorized structure that needed to be reviewed for compliance. I politely emailed her copies of my property deed and the documentation showing that the barn had been grandfathered in when the development was built. I thought that would be the end of it, but it was just the beginning. 3 days later, Karen showed up at my door unannounced, a thick binder tucked under her arm and her signature blonde highlighted bob perfectly coiffed despite the humid summer weather. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, not bothering with a hello, "I've reviewed your documentation, and while the barn structure itself may be grandfathered in, the current usage as a," she paused to check her notes, "home office and workshop is not consistent with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines." I leaned against my door frame, trying to maintain my composure. "Karen, it's Patricia," she corrected, chin raised. "Patricia," I amended. "My property line begins 30 feet behind where we're standing, and the barn is another 100 yards back. It's not visible from any community roads or properties. How exactly is it affecting the neighborhood aesthetic?" She sniffed disapprovingly. "Regardless of visibility, all structures within the Meadowbrook Estate zone must adhere to our guidelines. I'll need to inspect the interior to ensure compliance." I politely but firmly declined her request for an inspection, citing the clear language in the HOA bylaws that limited their jurisdiction to external appearances only. Karen left in a huff, warning me that this wasn't over. Over the next few months, I received violation notices. Everything from the height of my grass, which was perfectly within regulation, to the unauthorized vegetation in my garden, wildflowers native to our region that attracted beneficial pollinators. Each time I calmly responded with documented proof that I was within compliance, and each time Karen seemed to get more frustrated. Then came the annual Meadowbrook Estates Summer Gala. Traditionally, this event had been held at the community clubhouse, but renovations had made that impossible. This year, the board was scrambling to find a suitable alternative venue, and apparently, one day, while driving past my property, Karen had an epiphany. I was in my barn working on a particularly complex structural model for a new client when my doorbell rang incessantly. When I opened the door, Karen stood there with 3 other HOA board members, all wearing matching polo shirts with a Meadowbrook Estates logo embroidered on the breast pocket. "Good news, Mr. Reynolds," Karen announced, not waiting for an invitation before stepping into my foyer. "The board has decided to grant you an exemption from any barn violations." There were no valid violations to begin with, I interjected. "In exchange for allowing us to use your barn for this year's summer gala," she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "It's the perfect site for our 130 guests, and the rustic aesthetic will make for a charming country chic theme." "I stare here momentarily speechless. You want to use my private workspace for your party?" "The community party," she corrected. "As a resident of Meadowbrook Estates, you're a part of the community, aren't you? Unless you're suggesting you don't care about community spirit." The 3 board members behind her nodded in unison, looking at me expectantly. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, but I'm in the middle of a major project with tight deadlines. My equipment and materials are set up in the barn, and I can't risk having them damaged or disturbed. Karen's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. Mr. Reynolds, perhaps I didn't make myself clear. The board is prepared to overlook certain irregularities in your property's compliance in exchange for this small favor. Was she seriously threatening me? I felt my temper rising, but kept my voice level. Are you suggesting that if I don't let you use my private property for your event, you'll manufacture HOA violations against me? The board members behind her shifted uncomfortably, but Karen didn't miss a beat. I'm simply pointing out that cooperation tends to make community living more harmonious. The gala is in 3 weeks. We need access the day before to decorate. Before I could respond further, she handed me a document. Here's the formal request. I'm sure you'll make the right decision. We'll check back next week for your answer. And with that, they left, leaving me standing in my doorway, document in hand, absolutely fuming. I spent that evening reading through every line of the HOA bylaws and as I suspected, there was absolutely no provision that could compel a homeowner to allow community events on their private property. Additionally, I found numerous instances where Karen had overstepped her authority as HOA president in other matters. The next day, I called Mark Daniels, a friend from college who now worked as a real estate attorney specializing in HOA disputes. After explaining the situation, he confirmed what I already knew. They had no right to demand use of my property, and any retaliatory actions would be grounds for legal action against the HOA. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a firm but professional email to the entire board, declining their request and clarifying that any further harassment or retaliatory actions would result in legal consequences. I also attached the relevant sections of the bylaws for their reference. The response came not by email, but in person when Karen showed up at my door again 2 days later. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice sickly sweet, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. No one is threatening you. We are simply asking for a neighborly gesture that would benefit everyone in the community, including you." "I've made my position clear," I replied. "My property is not available for community events. I have work commitments that cannot be disrupted." Karen's fake smile faltered. "You know, several neighbors have complained about the noise coming from your barn. Power tools after 6 p.m., hammering on weekends. It's very disruptive." This was a blatant lie. My nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and I rarely use power tools after hours. "Feel free to file those complaints formally," I responded. "I'll be happy to address them through the proper channels." Now, if there's nothing else, the gala planning committee will be very disappointed. She interrupted. "We've already started designing invitations with your barn as the featured venue." I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a planning error on your part, not a problem on mine." Karen's pleasant facade cracked. "Listen here, Mr. Reynolds. One way or another, that barn will host our gala. I suggest you reconsider your position before things get unpleasant." And with that thinly veiled threat, she turned on her heel and stalked back to her luxury SUV. The following week was relatively quiet, and I thought perhaps Karen had given up and found another venue. I should have known better. On Thursday afternoon, I received an email from the HOA with a subject line, "Notice of Emergency Board Meeting Resolution Passed." Curious and more than a little concerned, I opened it immediately. The email stated that due to urgent community needs, an emergency board meeting had been held without notice to general members, which was against the bylaws, and a special resolution had been passed allowing the HOA to temporarily repurpose common areas and adjacent structures for community events. The kicker? They had arbitrarily redefined the border of my property, claiming that my barn was partially on land that was technically a common area easement. This was complete fiction, but they had attached a crudely edited plot map as evidence. I immediately called Mark, who was as outraged as I was. "This is completely illegal," he assured me. "They can't redefine property lines, and they certainly can't hold emergency meetings without proper notice to manipulate bylaws. Don't worry, we'll shut this down." Mark drafted a cease and desist letter that afternoon, which I hand-delivered to each board member's house. Karen wasn't home when I stopped by, so I left it in her mailbox. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of vehicles on my property. Looking out my window, I saw 3 cars parked near my barn and several people, including Karen, unloading boxes and decorations. I threw on some clothes and rushed out, cease and desist letter in hand. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded as I approached the group. Ken turned to me with a triumphant smile. "Setting up for the gala, of course. Didn't you get the notice?" The board vote was unanimous. "I also sent you a cease and desist letter from my attorney," he replied, holding up a copy. "You are trespassing on private property, and I'm asking you to leave immediately." Karen waved dismissively. "Your threats don't scare me, Mr. Reynolds. The revised easement clearly shows." "The revised easement is a fraudulent document," I interrupted. "You can't just redraw property lines because it's convenient for you. Now please remove yourselves and your belongings from my property before I call the police." One of the other volunteers, a middle-aged man I recognized as our neighborhood treasurer, looked uncomfortable. "Patricia, maybe we should discuss this further if he has legal representation." "Oh, stop being so spineless, Jim," Karen snapped. "He's bluffing. No one's calling the police." I pulled out my phone. "Try me." "Go ahead," she challenged. "The police will side with the HOA. They always do." I started dialing, but Karen snatched a set of keys from one of the volunteers and marched toward my barn. "Let's get these decorations inside while Mr. Reynolds here wastes the police's time." To my horror, she produced a key that actually opened my barn door. Later, I would discover that she had convinced the neighborhood handyman, who had once helped me fix my garage door, to make a copy of my barn key under the pretense that I had authorized it for emergency HOA access. Before I could stop her, Karen and 2 other volunteers had entered my barn and began moving my equipment aside to make room for tables and decorations. I was livid, but knew I needed to handle this carefully. I finished dialing 911 and explained the situation calmly, making it clear that people were trespassing on my property and refusing to leave. While waiting for the police, I watched helplessly as more volunteers arrived and began transforming my workspace into a party venue. Karen directed everything with smug authority, occasionally glancing my way with a victorious smirk after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 20 minutes. I saw a police car pull up my driveway. Officer Rodriguez, a reasonable man I'd met once during a community safety meeting, approached me first. "Mr. Reynolds, we received a call about trespassers on your property." I explained the situation as clearly and calmly as I could, showing him my property deed, the cease and desist letter, and a fraudulent revised easement the HOA had created. Officer Rodriguez listened carefully, then nodded. "Let me speak with the other party." He approached Karen, who immediately launched into a theatrical explanation about community easements and HOA authority. I couldn't hear everything, but her voice grew increasingly shrill as Officer Rodriguez asked pointed questions. Finally, he returned to me. "Sir, I've informed Miss Henderson that this appears to be a civil matter regarding property boundaries. However, until that's resolved in court, the current deed and property records stand, which means this is your private property. They need to leave if you're asking them to leave." Relief washed over me. "Thank you, officer. Yes, I want them all to leave immediately." Officer Rodriguez turned to address the group, many of whom were now looking uncertain and embarrassed. "Folks, I need everyone to pack up and vacate this property now. This is privately owned land, and you don't have permission to be here." Most of the volunteers quickly began gathering their things, murmuring apologies as they hurried back to their cars. Karen, however, stood her ground. "This is ridiculous," she exploded. "We have every right to use this space." The board voted. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said firmly, "the board can't vote to use someone else's private property without their consent. Now, please gather your belongings and leave, or you could be facing criminal trespassing charges." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This event is happening tomorrow. We have no other venue. 130 people are expecting." "That's not Mr. Reynolds' problem," Officer Rodriguez interrupted. "Please leave now." Fuming, Karen stormed past me toward her car, hissing as she passed. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." After everyone had left, Officer Rodriguez advised me to change my locks immediately and consider installing security cameras. I thanked him for his help, and he promised to file a report documenting the incident. That night, I called a 24-hour locksmith who came out and replaced all the locks on my barn. I also installed a simple security camera system that connected to my phone just to be safe. The next morning was Saturday, the day of the gala. I was working in my home office when my security camera alert pinged. Looking at my phone, I saw Karen and what appeared to be catering staff approaching my barn. I watched in disbelief as she tried her key in the new lock, then began pounding on the door in frustration. I grabbed my phone and headed outside. "Can I help you?" I called as I approached the group. Karen whirled around. "You changed the locks. How dare you? How dare I secure my own private property?" I replied calmly. "Yes, I changed the locks after catching trespassers using fraudulently obtained keys to enter without my permission." Karen's face contorted with rage. "The gala starts in 4 hours. We have nowhere else to go. You have to let us use the barn." "Actually, I don't," I said. "And after yesterday's stunt, I'm even less inclined to help you." "You'll regret this," she seethed. "I'll make sure of it." One of the catering staff cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Henderson, we really need to know where to set up. We have ice sculptures melting in the truck." Karen ignored him, still glaring at me. "One last chance, Reynolds. Open that barn, or I'll make your life a living hell." I crossed my arms. "Karen, Patricia, I have Officer Rodriguez's card right here in my pocket." I continued smoothly. "Should I call him back out? I'm sure he'd be interested to hear about further harassment after yesterday's incident." The caterer stepped forward again. "Miss Henderson, seriously, we need a decision. We have 4 other events today." For a moment, I thought Karen might actually explode. Her face was purple, her fists clenched so tightly that her knuckles were white. Then abruptly, she turned to the catering staff. "Set up in the cul-de-sac on Maple Drive," she ordered. "We'll have the gala in the street." The caterer blinked in surprise. "The street? But we need permits for that." "Just do it," Karen shrieked, causing the man to take a step back. I almost felt sorry for her as she stormed back to her car, shouting into her phone, presumably trying to notify guests about the venue change. Later that afternoon, my doorbell rang again. I checked my security camera first. Fool me once and all that, and was surprised to see Jim, the HOA treasurer, standing alone on my porch looking nervous. I opened the door cautiously. "Hello, Jim." "Mr. Reynolds," he began, twisting his hands anxiously. "I want to apologize for yesterday. I never would have been involved if I had known Patricia was lying about having permission to use your property." I nodded, appreciating his apology, but still wary. "The thing is," he continued, "the gala is happening in the Maple Drive cul-de-sac without permits, blocking several driveways. The police have been called, and it's a disaster." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not sure what you expect me to do about it." Nothing," Jim said quickly. "That's not why I'm here. I came to let you know that the board is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow morning to address Patricia's conduct. Several members, myself included, feel her actions have exposed the HOA to significant legal liability. We've also discovered that this isn't the first time she's falsified documents." Now he had my attention. "Go on. Would you be willing to attend the meeting and share your experience? I think it would help the board understand the severity of the situation." I agreed, and the next morning I arrived at the clubhouse conference room with Mark, my attorney, beside me. The room was packed with board members and several other homeowners who had apparently also had run-ins with Karen. Karen herself arrived late, looking significantly less put together than usual. When she saw me, she froze momentarily before plastering on a fake smile and taking her seat at the head of the table. Jim called the meeting to order and briefly explained why we were gathered. Then, one by one, homeowners stood to share their experiences with Karen's overreach, arbitrary rule enforcement, and in some cases, outright falsification. When it was my turn, I calmly presented the evidence of the trespassing incident, the fraudulent property map, and the illegal key copying. Mark then outlined the numerous bylaws and state laws that had been violated, making it clear that these actions had exposed the HOA to significant legal liability. Karen attempted to interrupt several times, but Jim firmly insisted that she would have her turn to speak after everyone else. By the time all the evidence had been presented, the atmosphere in the room was tense. Several board members were taking notes furiously, while others sat with expressions ranging from shock to fury. Finally, Jim turned to Karen. "Patricia, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations?" Karen stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "These are all misunderstandings and exaggerations. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to uphold community standards, which sometimes requires firm action. Perhaps I've been overzealous in some instances, but everything I've done has been for the good of Meadowbrook Estates." A board member named Susan spoke up, including falsifying property maps and making unauthorized copies of keys. Karen's confidence visibly faltered. Those were exceptional circumstances. The gala is our most important annual event, and we had no alternative venue. "That's not true," Jim countered. "I found emails showing you canceled our reservation at the Riverside Community Center 2 months ago, well before the supposed scheduling conflict." Murmurs rippled through the room, and Karen's face paled. Mark leaned forward. "Miss Henderson, my client has grounds for several serious legal claims against both you personally and the HOA as an entity. However, he's willing to consider not pursuing litigation if appropriate actions are taken today." All eyes turned to me, and I nodded in confirmation. Jim cleared his throat. "I move that we take an immediate vote of no confidence in Patricia Henderson as HOA president, and that she be removed from the board effective immediately." The motion was quickly seconded, and a vote was called. The result was unanimous, with even Karen's former allies turning against her. Jim stood to announce the result. "Patricia Henderson, by vote of the board, and in accordance with Section 7.3 of our bylaws regarding gross misconduct, you are hereby removed as president and board member of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, effective immediately. Please surrender your HOA records, keys, and access cards before leaving." Karen sat frozen, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Then, with a strangled cry of outrage, she shot to her feet, her chair crashing to the floor behind her. "You can't do this to me!" she shrieked, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "I made this neighborhood what it is. None of you appreciated how hard I worked. This is mutiny." As security was called to escort the still screaming Karen from the building, I caught her final wail of indignation. "I've been president for 5 years. 5 years. You'll regret this, all of you." And then she was gone, leaving behind nothing but the echo of her threats and the sweet, sweet silence of justice finally being served.